came all the way from New York City, Pennsylvania, depending on kind of how you track it. Let me just acknowledge right at the start here that this program, which is first of its kind, right? Bringing in outside speaker to speak about Quaker history at the Nine Partners Meeting House, would not have been possible without funding from Dutchess County. So we thank Will Tatum, county historian, right? Dutchess County government, right? For allocating funds for events related to the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. This is the first of two of these talks, and so on July 27th, which is the last Sunday in July, the same time, 2 o'clock, we're going to have another speaker, Carl Lounsbury from William and Mary down in Virginia. He's involved at Colonial Williamsburg. His focus is going to be on the architecture of this building and kind of putting it into the context of other kind of sacred space architecture from late 18th century America. A reminder that all summer long, even into the fall, we're having open houses right here. And so next Sunday, first Sunday of each month, there's an open house from 12 to 4 in this space. So if you know people who are interested in seeing this space, have never been inside it, couldn't make it to the talk today, encourage them to come next Sunday or the first Sunday of every month, all the way through November. How many people is it your first time in this space? Wow, that's a lot. It's pretty cool, right? Yeah. Hasn't really changed at all since 1780. And so I promised Sarah that I would be very, very brief in introducing her, so I'm just going to say that she is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and the most important qualification, right, for this talk, what is the team nickname, people from the University of Pennsylvania? What are their athletes called?
Quakers.
Quakers, right? And so that's it. That's all we need to know, right? And so I'll turn it over to Sarah. Take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robert. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure for me to be here. This is actually my first time in this building as well. And I just will say from the beginning about this talk, I published a book last summer. A lot of the research that I did in this book is going to be part of this talk today, but I also wrote this talk specifically for you for this afternoon. So you're the first audience who's going to hear this talk because I wanted to put in a lot of really local history about this place in this area. And I will also say I teach a lot of large classes at Penn. This is my History of American Law class. There's 170 students in that class. And as much as I'm sitting here in the front and I'm lecturing to you, I might stop a couple times in the middle and just sort of pause and see if there's questions or things I haven't said clearly. And I want to leave a lot of time at the end also for your questions. I'm also aware that there are people in this room who are part of local history societies who know this area really well. And I genuinely think you will have things to teach me. So I'm hoping this can be sort of a back and forth. The other reason I wanted to quickly show you what my wonderful students are like, I also teach a big class that looks very similar on the history of the American Revolution, is because I wanted to show you a real slide from my lectures at the University of Pennsylvania to start. This is a slide I show in lecture 12 on slavery and anti-slavery in the early republic, and if you'll notice, the area circled is where we are right now. And so I feel like part of my mission in life, even though I teach broadly about the 18th and 19th century colonial American United States, is to get people excited about the Hudson River Valley. Like, you would leave my course at Penn and think like that the Hudson River is the most important place that there ever was. I sort of think it's true, and so hopefully I have an audience here who agrees with me on that claim. But there are a lot of maps like this in these classes. So what I want to do at the very beginning is just tell you sort of on a big picture level what my book is about, and then spend most of the rest of the talk telling you about sort of the more local history of this area and how it relates to the book as a whole. So my book, The Rising Generation, is about the generation of Black children born between the 1790s and 1830s in New York State. And part of what I argue is that this generation of children, and in this talk I'll explain to you why this generation is so unique and important, that they shaped emancipation and the laws of citizenship in New York State, and then as they got older, how they helped expand and create national freedom in the United States in the 1860s and 70s. So the book actually covers over 200 years of history. Now, really important to that history are Quakers. You can see I even have Quaker in the title of the very first chapter of the book. And so what I'm going to be talking to you about today really focuses on some of the research and the stories from the first part of the book, in which Quakers and Quakers in this area here in Dutchess County are particularly important. So, the other thing I want to say briefly about why I focus on New York before we get into the particular local history of this part of New York is just because of how important New York State was in the 19th century. I'm talking to a bunch of New Yorkers. This is an easy audience. New York is important. It's always been important. But the thing you need to know about New York in the late 18th century and 19th century is just how powerful it was as a state within the larger union. So for example, by the time of the American Civil War, New York State has more electoral votes in like presidential elections than like 7 or 8 other states combined. It is financially and economically a powerful state. It's a state where the local party system, like when we think about today that we have a 2-party system, a lot of that 2-party system develops here in New York State. The other thing that's important about New York State is, especially in the early 19th century, it was a swing state, right? So most of us today don't think of New York as being a swing state. We have swing districts. They had that at the time. We still live in a swing district, right? I think right here today. But New York as a state was constantly flip-flopping back and forth. And so if you wanted to get something done in the United States, you had to have New York and its politicians and its people and its money on your side. And so I kind of argue that anything that happens in New York in the early 19th century sort of matters for the history of the country, including the people who lived there, people like Quakers, slaves, free black people, abolitionists, etc. Now, other basic thing to know about New York is just how much slavery was fundamental to the political economy of New York as a colony. So if you look at this map from 1770, you can see that there's actually almost 20,000 enslaved people in New York on the eve of the American Revolution, which is 4,000 more than even the state of Georgia. So among the northern colonies, slavery was very important to its wealth, to the way its politics operated. And because of the way New York was settled, most of the European settlement and most of slaves lived up and down the Hudson River Valley and along Long Island. So when we're thinking about New York in this time period, we're really looking sort of, the Hudson River Valley is key. And you can see that some of the darker areas are where slaveholding was particularly prevalent. And for reasons we'll talk about, you can see where we are right now, which is here. There was actually less slaveholding in this part of New York, in part because of its large Quaker population. Now here we're going to start diving really into the local history of Quakers and anti-slavery here in Dutchess County and around 9 Partners. So Quakers had started protesting slavery very early. They're the first white religious group really in the Atlantic world to, as a collective, raise questions about whether or not slavery, owning other human beings, is a sin. Is it something that's wrong? It doesn't mean that there weren't other people who thought slavery was wrong, but you see sort of collectives within Quakers earlier than any other denomination. And of course, slaves themselves are also protesting slavery from the second that they're enslaved. So there's this famous protest outside of Philadelphia by Germantown Quakers in 1688, raising the golden rule, right? Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. You see that kind of language in Quaker anti-slavery sermons and questionings going on decades after this moment. So this is sort of where Quakers theologically get their idea that holding people as slaves is wrong. And one of the things that I wanted to do in my book, I'm showing you like an actual footnote for those of you who, I don't know, took history in high school or college and had to footnote and sort of put all your Chicago Manual of Style like citations. This is a footnote from the book. A lot of the Quaker history of anti-slavery around the Revolutionary period often focuses on Pennsylvania, right? Robert introduced me as, we have the Penn Quakers. People think of Pennsylvania as the Quaker colony. But there were a lot of Quakers in New York Colony, particularly in this area. And so part of what I wanted to do in the book was also talk more about the Quaker history of early New York. And so to do that, as a historian, you go to the archives. And so what I started doing in my research, this was back when I was in graduate school, is trying to find every possible source, primary sources about Quakers in this area. This is from a bunch of microfilm. And I do like to show this just also because my current students find this sort of funny of like what it might be like to try to transcribe early Quaker records. Not simple. What I love about the Quakers, and those of you who've studied the Quakers, is they're very literary. They're very epistolary. If you've been to a Quaker meeting or you've looked at a Quaker, they take minutes of everything. The other thing I have to say that I love about the Quakers is often the women met on their own, right? So like it's a quite egalitarian religion. Women are allowed to speak at meetings from the beginning. Quakerism is founded by George Fox and then his wife, Margaret Fell. And so both men and women sort of would take minutes of their meetings. And so at least if you want to learn something about Quakers, they're good to study because they write a lot. But reading what they wrote is not always easy. And so just to show you, this is really me in the library, like transcribing on my notebook, like what is it that they're saying in the early 1700s? In this particular record, this is Quakers on Long Island in the early 1700s, sort of discussing among themselves whether or not slavery is right or wrong. And they end up being fully satisfied in their conscience that slavery was not right. And so I don't want to paint a picture today that all Quakers were anti-slavery. Many Quakers, in fact, owned slaves. But there's this persistent questioning within Quaker meetings, going back hundreds of years, that slavery is wrong. And another place you see that is right around here. So this Quaker house must be, I mean, this is I've actually never been there in Pawling and Quaker Hill, but I imagine this is like, how many minutes away? Yeah, half an hour. It's going to be my next stop. That it's actually right here in Nine Partners in this part of Dutchess County, where you also get some of the most sort of persistent questions about the morality of slavery. And so to give you an example, you can start seeing in the 1750s, local Quakers from this part of New York Colony are writing to the New York Yearly Meeting in New York City. That's sort of like the biggest group of Quakers that are in New York or in New York City. And they're writing to those New York City Quakers and they're saying, we think this is wrong. We think we need to do something about this. The New York City Quakers, like many people in New York City, this is where kind of like the rich and the fancier people live. It's Quaker merchants. They're like, yeah, slavery might not be so great, but, you know, it's very complicated. And then, you know, it's like, you know, it might be difficult to try to do anything about it. So it's really actually these sort of Hudson River Valley, Dutchess County Quakers from around here who are pushing the sort of more like fancy Quakers in New York City to move against slavery. Now, as this is happening, there's also efforts by enslaved people and free people themselves to raise questions about the morality of slavery. In fact, the first published Black poet in North America is from New York Colony. He's a poet named Jupiter Hammond. He's on Long Island. He's enslaved by a wealthy family there called the Lloyds. And so at the same time that sort of the Quakers are getting a little more persistent in raising their anti-slavery voices, we also see Black New Yorkers as well sort of raising questions about slavery in print. Now, Jupiter Hammond was not Quaker himself. He was an evangelical Christian, not Quaker. But you can see, again, this sort of Christian language in his poetry about sort of, right, like grace to every nation. This sort of Christian sense of do unto others is coming out in his poetry as well. One of Hammond's biographers actually posits that Hammond might have heard the Pennsylvania Quaker John Woolman preach in the mid-1700s. Quakers, in addition to writing a lot, traveled a lot amongst each other. To sort of what they call weighty friends, and weighty friends meant sort of like important friends, important Quakers, would travel from meeting to meeting and sort of create bonds among meetings in the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic. John Woolman was an abolitionist Quaker who traveled to Long Island, and then also, this is from his diary, traveled to this part of New York Colony as well in the 1750s, sort of preaching this anti-slavery message. The other way you see people sort of pushing against slavery in the 1750s and 60s is through court cases. So I'm also a legal historian. I mentioned at the beginning that I teach a class on the history of American law. This is an example, I was so excited when I found this, of a woman named Sarah, whose son was being held as a slave in Dutchess County in Fishkill. And this is a legal document where it's called De Homine Replegiando. This is like so I think most of us, or I hope many of us, are familiar with this idea of the writ of habeas corpus. it's been in the news a lot recently, and sort of that sort of this ancient English liberty that goes all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215, the idea that you should be able to go to a court and protest unjust imprisonment. Dominare replegiando is a similar kind of ancient common law writ. And so you'll see people sort of going to local courts to try to free themselves or their family members using these processes of English law. Okay, so to sort of sum up what I've said so far, in the 1760s and 70s, we see anti-slavery lawmakers, abolitionists, especially Quakers, enslaved and free black people themselves in various northern states, well, they're not quite states yet, that should really say colonies, pushing for anti-slavery measures in legislatures, courts, regiments, and daily life. And so to give you a few examples, does anyone know who that is? So she's probably the most famous female poet. That's Phyllis Wheatley. So Phyllis Wheatley is a slave in Boston in the early 1770s, and she starts publishing anti-slavery poetry. Her poems end up in New York newspapers. So we have that kind of sort of print protest against slavery. We have black men, particularly in the northern colonies, joining the American Revolution as soldiers. Many of the northern states ended up passing laws saying that men who were enslaved, if they fought on the side of the patriots in the American Revolution, would be able to earn their freedom. There's my picture of Quakers. That one's always in my slides. It's not even just for today. Quakers sort of remain really key voices in the American Revolution, sort of pushing other patriots to think about what liberty means. Like, what does this opportunity mean if we're casting off the British Empire and we're saying this is a fight for certain kinds of liberty and freedom and equality? How far do we mean to go with that? Quakers are definitely asking their fellow patriots that question. And then this is a New Yorker. He's one of my favorite New York founding fathers, who I think is so interesting. It doesn't get enough play. There's no musical about him. He's not even mentioned in Hamilton, but he's super important. And I'm just like, for pure curiosity's sake, does anyone know who that is? It's not John Jay, but he's very good friends with John Jay. So that it's like totally thinking in the right direction. And there's going to be a slide with him with John Jay, like in 3 minutes.
It's not Hamilton.
It's not Hamilton. But he's friends with all of, it's just sort of funny who like gets remembered and who doesn't. So this, it's Governor Morris. So Governor Morris ends up, like a decade later, he wrote the preamble to the Constitution, that whole "We the People." That's Governor Morris. He's a really important founding father from New York. He's a Hudson River Valley man. He lives in this like huge manor called Morrisania, north of what is now New York City. And so he's going to be a key figure that I'm going to keep sort of talking about. But all these are like different kinds of people, right? Like different parts of society, different parts of a local area in different ways pushing to end slavery in the Revolutionary period. And what I really want to stress about the Quaker part, and this is actually like a part of my book to the extent that anyone reads a young professor's first book. You write first books like this to get tenure. You're trying to like impress other scholars. Hopefully some of you have actually already bought it. It's like legible. It's like written for people, but it's you know it's a little like long on the footnotes and the sort of scholarly talk. But one of the things I really wanted my book to tell other scholars was to realize that Quakers are abolishing slavery and pushing against slavery before the American Revolution. And there's sort of this narrative of like, and the American Revolution happens, and then we decide we're going to start freeing people. And there's part of that that's true, but Quakers are doing it well before there's an American Revolution, right? They're like for decades before the American Revolution, they've already sort of like made this an ethical issue among themselves. So now I want to show you a couple of primary source documents from this particular Quaker meeting, right from this area. And they're a little hard to read, but I'll sort of translate them from you. But this is from local minutes. It says monthly minutes of friends held at Oblong and 9 partners circularly, or is that quarterly? Circularly. And so I want to sort of show you what Quakers in this very area were doing about slavery in the 1760s and 1770s. Okay, so once Quakers had sort of decided among themselves that they thought slavery was wrong, one of the things they started to do was to persuade Quakers in their local areas to free their slaves. And you can imagine any group of people, right? Like any congregation, any town, you're gonna have people who are like really into an idea and people who are really reluctant. And so part of what Quakers had to do is cajole each other and push each other to voluntarily free their slaves. So they go on these visits. So here, there's a particular visit to Daniel Tobias who promises that he will give his slave his freedom. I just like this as another example. Another thing that Quakers are pacifists. And so another thing that they would regulate among themselves is if there were other Quakers who were going to militia training, right? But this is another sort of example of like, we're gonna make sure that the people in our local area are following our ethical code. Here's an example that a complaint came to the preparative meeting at 9 Partners against John Keefe for buying a Negro slave, right? And so once people saw other people in the area doing things that they thought was wrong, they would sort of visit each other and try to persuade them to see the error of their ways. This is a pretty dark example of this too. There's a complaint against Benjamin Lapham for buying a Negro wench, which is a sort of a common term at the area, a derogatory term for like a poor servant or usually, in this case, usually a black female slave, and being familiar with her in a carnal manner, right? So there's sort of, I think, an implication here of some sort of sexual coercion that other Quakers found out about and then went to this Quaker to push him on it. This is an example of a local man named Stephen Haight who eventually got disowned for buying a slave. So he'd been visited a bunch by fellow Quakers and sort of didn't free his slave, and eventually they disown him. Okay. So as Quakers are sort of thinking about how they're going to abolish slavery among themselves, they come up with sort of policies of how does one free slaves within your community. And one of the things that they do that was particularly interesting to me was think about what would happen to the children of slaves. And so when Quakers talk about ending slavery among themselves, they talk about freeing adults, but then they talk about having certain obligations to enslaved children. So not only would you free enslaved children, but Quakers say amongst themselves that they will therefore also have an obligation to teach children, teach them how to read, how to write. You hear language like act the part of the father, meaning like act to a child in your household who's enslaved as you would act towards your own children. Again, it's that kind of golden rule way of thinking about it. And so there's this intense emphasis in Quaker anti-slavery on education and schooling and sort of responsibilities to black children. And so as you start seeing various Quakers emancipating children, there's often in the records, you'll see sort of mentions of sort of boys and girls being freed. And it's a little hard to see here. Oh, here, let me see if I can use you can see there it says school learning, right? So as they're freeing people, part of what they're saying too is that young people who are freed, we will also find ways to educate them. Okay, so here's where we're gonna connect back to the founding fathers of New York and our old friend Governor Morris, and you were right on the John Jay part. They're very good friends. So in 1777, at the beginning of the American Revolution, a bunch of sort of elite New Yorkers have to create the state's first constitution. And at the Constitutional Convention, Governor Morris is there, and he tries to actually insert into New York's first constitution a clause to abolish slavery. So we have the records of the place, of the meetings where these men are creating New York's constitution. John Jay was actually there and then had to go home to take care of his sick mother. But the Constitution ends up getting adopted in New York with no measures against slavery. And both Governor Morris and John Jay are disappointed, right? So Jay writes this letter to Morris and says, the Constitution was cut like a harvest cut before it was ripe. He had wanted a clause against the continuation of domestic slavery, right? So they don't get it in the Constitution, but these are are among the most powerful men in New York during the Revolution. And it really matters to the history of New York State that some of the founding fathers had genuine anti-slavery beliefs and were interested in acting on them. What also happens during the Revolution, and I imagine this is familiar to many of you in this area, is the British occupy New York during the American Revolution. So a lot of New York State is actually sort of under military occupation by the British forces. New York City is completely taken over by the British. There's actually also quite a lot of loyalists in New York. New York is a swing state even then. And there's a moment in which you could argue that the entire fate of the American Revolution sort of hinges on something in New York, which is that a very, very bad thing, if you're a patriot, almost happens at West Point with what might be the most famous traitor in American history, arguably, Benedict Arnold. Thank you. So Benedict Arnold is in 1780, has plans to hand over West Point, not that far from here, right on the other side of the river. Benedict Arnold, the Patriot general, has plans to hand West Point over to the British, thereby allowing the British to have all of New York State, cut off if you have all of New York State, you're cutting off all the New England colonies, and you have a much better chance of winning the American Revolution. This story is relatively familiar to people. Even my students who don't know the story are like, Benedict Arnold, that guy's not good, right? We kind of know that name and that idea of this sort of near miss. What I think is often missing from the story is the fact that one of the men who helped thwart Benedict Arnold and his plans was a black patriot from Westchester County named John Peterson. Here he is in the census. Basically, John Peterson, this black soldier from just south of here, and two other Patriot veterans had noticed a bunch of ships on the Hudson River, being a little suspicious. And they were like, there's something off about these ships. And it turned out that the ships were actually part of Benedict Arnold meeting this British guy named Major John Andre. And they're like, we should tell somebody because there's something sketchy going on in the Hudson River. And Benedict Arnold gets caught and sort of saved West Point and saved New York from going entirely to the British. And I think sort of part of what I try to do in this book, and I think when I teach and I think about history, is sort of parts of the way we tell the history of the American Revolution, including people like John Peterson, who were, at crucial moments really sort of turned the tides of the war. So Peterson actually lives well into the 19th century. So this is just a July 4th celebration in 1838 where local citizens are toasting John Peterson from saving West Point during the American Revolution. Okay, so I think do y'all feel like you have 5-10 minutes left in you? Okay, I just want to make sure. Sometimes this is a beautiful Sunday and I just want to, you can be honest with me. I'm going to do 5 or 10 more minutes, but before I go further, are there any burning questions or confusions or clarifications? Yes, please.
What happened to all the slaves that were freed? What did they do? Did they have trade or?
That's a great question. So can I actually come back to that in 2 minutes? But that's a really good question. Anything that I've said so far that was confusing? Yes. Yeah.
You said that obviously Pennsylvania is the Quaker state, but did New York actually have more Quakers in absolute number than Pennsylvania?
So absolute numbers, Pennsylvania has more.
We can't hear.
Yes, let me repeat the question. Let me repeat it. So the question was if New York or Pennsylvania had more Quakers in absolute numbers. Pennsylvania has more. Probably about twice as many, something like that roughly. But outside of Pennsylvania, New York is next in terms of the largest number of Quakers in the colonies. And then there's a considerable number of Quakers in New England. But the truth is, New England is so Puritan and then eventually Congregationalist. There's actually Quakers who were hanged in Massachusetts colony for their religious beliefs. I love Massachusetts, but they can be mighty intolerant in the colonial era. If we think about the Scarlet Letter and stuff right? So New York actually is a relatively religiously tolerant colony, in part because of its history with sort of having the Dutch first and then New York come in. So you have Dutch Reform and then you have English Anglicans. And so it's a place actually where Quakers were able to worship in peace. And then Pennsylvania itself is founded as a Quaker colony. But I think New York, I think we skip over how important Quakerism was in New York, in part because it's not quite the New England story and not quite the Pennsylvania story, but absolute numbers are bigger in Pennsylvania. Okay. Yeah, please.
This may be really far-fetched, but is there any relation between what you were saying about the Puritans and what just jumps out at me is witchcraft?
Yeah.
Is what's going on here with the push for abolition caught up with the witchcraft accusations?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'll say just briefly on that. The most sort of, obviously, like the most famous witch trials are like Salem in the 1690s. New York doesn't have as like, doesn't get swept up as much in sort of like witchcraft stuff as New England. I will say though that if you look at the Salem records and the witch trial records, there's like a black woman accused. There's a lot of like racialized language. When the white Salem girls talk about having seen the devil, it's often like he has dark skin, Indian skin. New England at this time period is also in constant war. If you think about like, there's actually 4 French and Indian wars. So I guess what I would just say is like, sort of conceptually, there are definitely like, you can make connections between sort of fears of racialized others and slaves and witchcraft and how that all plays out. But it's less part of the history of like New York colony specifically.
But then just getting back to that area was just very strong in the Puritan.
Yes, and quite homogenous in terms of like it's religious, like it's sort of a religious monoculture in many ways. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few more slides, but then I'll stop again. Okay, so once the revolution ends, an important abolitionist group is founded in New York City called the New York Manumission Society. It is mostly Quakers. Quakers do most of the grunt work, but there's some fancy people in it, like John Jay, like Alexander Hamilton, James Duane, who's the mayor of the city. So it's this kind of incredibly useful organization because you have Quakers doing all the hard work, and then you have like the famous guys who are like, we're putting our names on here, right? And this group, you need both kinds of people in any organization. This group becomes very important in actually pushing New York to pass laws against slavery. And I love this letter. This is a letter from Charles Adams to John Adams, his John Adams, the president of the United States, John Adams, speaking about how in the 1790s that Quakers had formerly owned slaves, but now they want to set them at liberty, and they're not going to stop there. They're making the rest of us do it. So part of the important thing to understand about Quaker anti-slavery is first they do it among themselves. That's a lot of the slides that I showed you. And then they really start lobbying everybody else. They're going to lobby the New York State Legislature, the New York governor, local people to sort of do in the larger world what they had done in their own communities. And simultaneously, you have enslaved and free black people themselves who, continuing from the colonial era, are pushing their case in courts. So this is actually records from the New York Manumission Society. And what I really think is so interesting about this is this is a list on the left here of black New Yorkers who are bringing legal cases to free themselves or their children with the help of all of these Quakers and lawyers like Alexander Hamilton. How many of them are women? And it's often women who are trying to free themselves and their children. To answer the question about sort of what are people doing for work, both in slavery and afterwards. A lot of black women and children are working in domestic labor. So they're working as cooks, they're working as nannies, as seamstresses, they're doing laundry, and they continue to do a lot of that kind of work in freedom. Black men are working, they're working in farmland in the Hudson River Valley, but they're also working, again, both before and after slavery, in anything involving water. And what I mean by that is they're taking boats up and down the Hudson River Valley, right? So if you're growing farm produce in the Hudson River Valley, you need to get it to markets in Albany or New York City. It's often black men doing that physical work. And then black men are often working in the New York City seaport. And by some estimates, by the early 1800s, 25% of free black men in the Northeast are working on ships. They're like at sea as fishermen, as traders, as sailors. And so there's a really interesting there are some black families who were together who were intact, but one of the reasons you see women, and particularly here with children, is because of the particular forms of like what the work people are that they're actually doing, who were they with. And sometimes black fathers are separated either when they're enslaved or when they're free because of the particular labor that people are doing during the time period. So New York finally in 1799 passes an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. John Jay is governor, so he really pushes this through with his friends in the legislature. And what you'll see in sort of the details of this act is that it's in some ways a replication of what Quakers had done among themselves, but it's also in other ways more conservative. So what New York does to abolish slavery is it says that after July 4th of that year, children born to enslaved mothers will be born free, but have to work as servants for their mother's masters until adulthood, until they're age 25 and 28. Adult slaves remain enslaved. So unlike what the Quakers did, the Quakers freed adults and freed children and then said that they're going to educate them. New York sort of does the children part, but does not free adult slaves. And so that is in some ways what like drove the research of this whole book and why it's called The Rising Generation, is because to me it was fascinating to have an entire generation of children born into a different legal status than their parents. And I started my career as a high school teacher, and I have always been interested in what young people think and what their politics are and what they do and what they talk about and how they relate to each other. And so part of what I was sort of curious about when I started the research is like, you have this entire generation of young people who are experiencing this thing together, like a certain kind of political awakening together. Their parents and their teachers and local ministers are telling them, you are the free generation. You are going to grow up and do great things. And I was like, that seems like a story. Like, I mean, that's sort of what started the whole thing. And then it took me 10 years to write this book. But it was this sort of looking at this law and being like, this seems really interesting. I bet there's a lot to unpack here. Now, one thing that happens a couple of years later is that the state legislature actually passes additional amendments to this law, and they have to actually add in certain parts about Quakers, because Quakers had been manumitting slaves for so long that they needed sort of like special like stipulations under the law to make sure that the manumissions, the freedom that they had given slaves for years, were legally like recognizable in local areas. So Quakers sort of end up staying a really important part of the story. All right, so here we are on our last couple of slides. And this is sort of where like the second half of the book goes that I'm not going to talk to you about today, but just to sort of let you know sort of like what's the payoff of understanding all of this history. So The Rising Generations, the book's connected arguments, is that New York's particularly important. I hope I proved that to you. Not only the famous people, and I write about a lot of famous people in the book, but ordinary New Yorkers, including the thousands of children who are part of this special generation. And it's especially these children born sort of around and after that 1799 law that I just explained. And so these are some of the famous people who are in the book: Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, his Secretary of State, William Seward, who's a New Yorker, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman. For those of you who saw the movie Glory, which I adore, it's about a Massachusetts regiment of black soldiers during the Civil War. But fun fact that you can tell people at a dinner party this summer, there are more New York men in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment than men from Massachusetts. Like New Yorkers everywhere, right? So this famous Massachusetts regiment, more New Yorkers than Bay Staters, including two of Frederick Douglass's own sons who were from Rochester, New York. Frederick Douglass ends up settling in Rochester, New York. And so the famous people are in the book, but also there are lots of ordinary, everyday people. I spent a lot of time on road trips. I spent a lot of times in like old, dusty, like courthouses and clerks' offices and like county archives. This is from the Hudson and Columbia County, the county clerk's office. This is stuff from Rhinebeck and Dutchess County, the birth certificates of all those children who were born under the 1799 law. Stanford Historical Society right near here. I've never met Kathy Spears. I think some of you know her, but she helped me in my research. So this was all sort of stuff I put in the book of trying to find everything I possibly could from unpublished records, from children who were brought into court for various reasons. So this is the testimony of a young girl in 1811 talking about understanding her own status. And so I think the point I'm trying to make here as I sort of show you all of these things very quickly is just how much there actually was in the record. This is about schooling black children, Quakers opening up a school for black children. There was actually a lot to find when you started looking. It's just a reminder, though, that so much of what's interesting in history isn't published, it's not in print, it's not digitized. It relies on historical societies and libraries and archivists to actually keep this stuff safe. There's so much there. This is from a school in New York City called the African Free School, run by a bunch of Quakers in 1817. And so all of this sort of ended up being the evidence that allowed me to tell my story. And I think I'm going to stop there. I have a few more slides, but I think I've given you the main point because I want to just let you all have a break from hearing my voice and give plenty of time for questions. Yes?
When did the slave trade begin in New York?
When did it begin?
Did it begin with the Dutch?
It began with the Dutch. There are slaves among the Dutch starting from like the 1620s and 30s. So it's sort of from more or less the moment of European settlement, there is slaveholding. And what's interesting is the Dutch are obviously in New Amsterdam, but there remain a lot of like Dutch descended families here in the Hudson River Valley. And so if you remember that map I showed in the beginning of sort of some of the counties that have like a particularly high number of slaves, a lot of those were Dutch descended farming families. Sojourner Truth, the well-known abolitionist from the Hudson River Valley, in the 1800s, her first language is Dutch, right? I mean, that's how much sort of like slaveholding persists among Dutch families. The English take over in the 1660s and they continue right along with the slave trade.
The Quakers, when did the Quakers start arriving?
The Quakers start arriving in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And they settle, there are some in New York, but most of them are like Flushing and really early on Long Island. And then, I mean, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I think they're in this part of New York sort of starting in the early 1700s mostly? 1730s. 1730s, there you go. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
This is a very specific question, but you mentioned in the beginning enslaved people that were publishing poetry.
Yeah.
How did that work? I mean, how were they able to be publishing poetry about their conditions while they were slaves?
So it was very rare. For sort of, I think, obvious reasons, which are most people in colonial America don't read or write. Certainly most enslaved people are not learning how to read or write. Jupiter Hammond was sort of an interesting case. His family had been enslaved by the Lloyds, this wealthy family on Long Island, for decades. The Lloyds, so Lloyd Manor, so he grows up on, exactly. But the Lloyds were quite serious evangelical Christians themselves. And there were, it's sort of an interesting sort of paradox, but even the Anglican Church has this thing called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And so there are certain Christian denominations who sanction slavery, right? They're not saying to end slavery, but who think that even slaves should learn how to read and write. And so there are occasions, and this is more common in the northern colonies than the southern colonies, where enslaved people are learning how to read and write, particularly so they can read the Bible. And then when Jupiter Hammond first gets published in 1761, it's really interesting to read his poetry over the years, because the first poem just looks, I mean, in some ways it's a poem about Christianity and faith. The poem is not like free the slaves. But as he gets older, and as the American Revolution happens, he starts publishing poems and then ends up actually publishing a speech where he's very specific and he says, I'm old and I don't necessarily need my freedom, but young children should be freed. And so there's a way in which you could argue that like he's sort of pushing the envelope, but he's not so radical that like a certain kind of white printer or slave owner isn't willing to see his poems published. Does that make sense? Yeah. But for the most, and that's why I think actually the sort of the Quaker emphasis on education and opening these schools, the generation that I'm talking about in my book, by the 1820s, that the African Free School in New York City is enrolling thousands of black children, and it's free. It's partly funded by taxpayer money and private funds. And so this is, I would argue, and I think I'm right, ends up being the most literate, the most widely literate generation of black Americans, like the earliest. And I think that has like tremendous impact.
Why did it end in 1830? And then we specifically ended it in that year.
Oh, wait, what ended in 1830?
The generation of children that you're talking about.
Okay, that's a good question. All right, so I will actually show you. This is actually a really important slide. So this is actually about I had a couple of slides about black voters, because black men actually get to vote in New York for a while. Wait, where is it? Hold on, let me go back. So here it is, perfect. Okay, so in part because there are important anti-slavery forces in New York, right? So you have like black people themselves, you have these Quakers, you have anti-slavery lawyers, you have at least the Federalist Party is relatively anti-slavery, and you have a lot of black men voting, which I think is also a very like it should be, I think, a wider understanding. Black men vote in the early 1800s, and because there are so many swing districts, they actually end up deciding elections sometimes. And so there's a couple of legislatures in the 1810s that are quite anti-slavery in their politics. And in 1817, the governor of New York State is a former member of the New York Manumission Society. His name is Daniel Tompkins. And the New York State legislature passes a law that says all slaves in New York will be free in 1827. And this is huge. There's no other state in the country that passes a law like this. Like this, like again, I feel like I have like a fish in a barrel here because you're all New Yorkers, but like this is actually a huge deal that in the time period well after the American Revolution and well before the Civil War, a relatively democratically elected state legislature says we are passing a law that is going to free all the enslaved people in the state. Now, granted, anti-slavery people wanted it done right then in 1817. And so if anyone studies politics, you never get everything you want. And so there's a 10-year lag. That's a long time. That's a long lag. But in 1827, on one day, all the remaining slaves in New York are freed. And so if slavery is ending, that means you're going to not have children born into that condition anymore. And so that's why it's really a specific generation born between like the late 1790s and the late 1820s, and that's the generation at the heart of the book. Does that make sense? And it's really interesting. I mean, we're about to come up on the 200th year anniversary of that moment, so I think New York is going to be talking about it more, but it's a law that I think should be like more well known.
Does your book then go on to talk about the role that generation played in the Underground Railroad and
yes.
This area as well?
Yes. So the back half of the book, and I'll just show you a couple of slides really quickly, really ends with, you can see this is the North Star. This is Frederick Douglass's newspaper in 1850. Basically, sort of my argument is this generation grows up and like they're the ones running the Underground Railroad. They're founding the black newspapers. Frederick Douglass originally goes to Massachusetts. I feel like my New Yorker pride is coming through real hard today, but he's like in Massachusetts. He's with William Lloyd Garrison. It's this whole other branch of anti-slavery. And then he realizes that it's actually the New Yorkers who like understand how to do this better. I love Garrison. He's great. But New York, he comes to New York. And I think part of the reason he comes to New York is precisely because of like the networks and the churches and the schools and the politics that are built by this generation. And so I think like what's really funny is you can read some like letters of people who like Frederick Douglass comes to New York, and there's like these black abolitionists who are like, we got him, he understands our way of doing things. And so yes, it's that, and then you can argue that sort of it's the Underground Railroad and a certain kind of politics in New York that actually sort of pushed the Civil War to happen the way it does too. So like when the southern states leave the Union, they do things like complain about the Underground Railroad in New York, right? Like if you read South Carolina secedes from the Union in December of 1860, and South Carolina writes like a bullet point list of like, here's why we're leaving the Union. It's very much modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And there's stuff in there where they're like, it's the Underground Railroads and it's those New York courts and it's like all those Northerners and we have to leave the Union and Lincoln is president and, you know, all hell breaks loose. You had a question, yes.
You talked about the importance of the 1817 law and that freed any remaining slaves in New York.
Yes.
It was my understanding from general reading, and I look forward to reading your book very much, that New York was a laggard state, that really most of the northern states, where slavery was not as economically important, most of them freed their slaves in the immediate aftermath of the war, with the exception of New Jersey, which I just learned never freed its slaves. So I'm confused by your saying that the importance of that 1817 law, it seems to me laggard from what the rest of the northern states did.
It's a really, really well-stated and good question. And I'll just say on the New Jersey point, there are still some slaves on the New Jersey census in 1860, right, on the eve of the Civil War. I think what you're getting at is precisely what makes New York so interesting. So, for example, New Hampshire abolishes slavery in like the 1780s in the wake of its state constitution. There's like several hundred slaves in New Hampshire, right? Vermont has about 300 slaves. Vermont's its own independent republic for a while, but frees those slaves in its constitution. Massachusetts, there's a court decision in 1783 that frees slaves. So on the one hand, you're totally right. There's all of these New England states who have sort of freed slaves much more quickly. And to those several hundred slaves in Vermont and New Hampshire, that matters a lot. But you have 20,000 slaves in New York. And so what makes New York interesting is it's the place where it's hardest to end slavery. New Jersey doesn't even have as many slaves. Pennsylvania has I think 5,000 or 6,000 slaves when it frees slavery. New York is the place where it's the hardest to do it, and it's the hardest fight, but they get it done. And so it's not to be like, yay, New York, they're so enlightened, right? It takes them decades, to your point. But as someone sort of interested in politics and how change happens and how you do the hard fights, New York is the place that's the hardest fight and they win. Whereas Delaware, right, Maryland, right, these other border states who consider gradual abolition and they never pass it. So New York is kind of the one right on the cusp. Does that make sense? But you're right, it is far more conservative. There are more slaves for longer in New York than some of its neighbors. Yes, please.
New York seems to be this really interesting testing ground during this period. And I'm wondering about the step generation you're talking about. Are they involved at all in the Liberian movement? In 1821, I think it was Elizabeth leaves from New York Harbor and goes to establish what would become eventually the Republic of Liberia.
Yes. So, and just to make sure everyone's sort of on the same page with this really good question, in the 1810s, for a whole host of reasons, including the fact actually that more northern states are becoming free, and by this point too, the Midwestern states are starting to enter the Union as free states. There's this movement called the colonization movement. The American Colonization Society is founded in 1817 by a bunch of sort of white elites some of them who would call themselves generally anti-slavery, but the way that they want to they're interested in ending slavery, but they're going to do it by freeing people and then sending them to Africa, to places like Liberia or Sierra Leone outside the United States. And for many Black Americans, this is not the option, right? For some of them, they've been Americans for multiple generations, right? They were their ancestors were taken from Africa 150 years ago. So they're interested in being free. They're not interested in being shipped back to Liberia. And so most African Americans protest this movement. They are not for colonization. But there is a minority who are interested in it. And so, for example, there actually are a bunch of several hundred Black New York families who voluntarily go to Haiti in the 1820s, and partly because Haiti's this independent Black republic, and this is exciting, and it's hard to make a living in New York City, and there's racism, and we're going to go to Haiti. And what's interesting is that most of the families actually end up coming back. And so most Black New Yorkers, the vast majority, oppose the colonization movement. They see themselves as being from this place. They're American, they're New Yorkers, they want to stay. And they're very insistent on their citizenship. What's interesting about New York is there's all sorts of ways in which citizenship in New York is not equal for Black people, but at the same time, they are at law considered citizens. And that sort of citizenship, that formal political belonging, this sense of we are part of this state and the state owes us things, is very much part of their sort of political thinking, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit to the Northwest Ordinance?
Sure.
Which is sort of like a federal law before there was a federal.
Yeah.
Before there was a federal government,
Yeah.
but in fact, the Northwest Ordinance is sort of this unique thing where in fact in the states that were going to be formed, there slavery was banned. So did New Yorkers play a major role in that, or was that more of a national? I guess what was the gestalt around the whole thing?
Yes.
But you're allowed to highlight New York.
Yes. So thank you. So the Northwest Ordinance, the original idea for the Northwest Ordinance actually comes about 1784 in the Continental Congress before we have a US Constitution. So there's this, we have a Congress, but it's a unicameral legislature and they have a very hard time getting anything done. But it's actually one of Jefferson, this is where like Jefferson is so complicated as sort of both a pro-slavery and anti-slavery figure who never frees the majority of his own slaves. But Jefferson wanted the Midwest to be free. And so in his actual original draft of the Northwest Ordinance, he proposes that this territory, what we now, in the areas that we now call Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, should I say Indiana? Wisconsin. It's the places that become those 5 states. The United States has now received all that land and part of winning the war. And so they're like, we got all this territory from the British Empire. We won the war. What are we going to do with this territory? And so the Northwest Ordinance says we're going to allow this territory into the country. This territory will eventually come in as states, but we're going to abolish slavery there. We're not going to allow slavery to go into the Northwest Territory. And eventually the various states come in like through those mechanisms as free states. Rufus King, who is a New Yorker, is actually sort of part of like some subsequent legislation, so there is some New York story in there. But I would say 2 quick things that do relate to New York on this. So the Northwest Ordinance becomes this federal or national model of not having slavery in the territories. And in some ways, that's sort of the big fight throughout the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln, in part, sort of runs on this idea that we should not allow new territory into the United States if there are going to be slaves there. The Missouri crisis happens in 1819, 1821. And the Missouri crisis is this big fight in Congress over whether or not Missouri, this new territory, will come into the United States as a slave state or a free state. And that sort of question about, are we going to use the Northwest Territory model where we only allow free states into the Union, or are we going to allow, is there a different kind of model where we're going to have more slave states in the Union? That whole Missouri crisis is actually instigated by a Dutchess County congressman named James Talmadge Jr., who's practicing law in Poughkeepsie. And what James Talmadge Jr. does is he goes to Congress and he says, here's what we're going to do in Missouri. We're going to pass a gradual abolition law for existing slaves in Missouri Territory that looks exactly like New York's 1799 law. And we're going to sort of pair it with the Northwest Ordinance model, which is to say that Congress is allowed to regulate what happens in the territories. I hope what I said made some sense. There was like actually a lot of sort of like constitutional law in there, federal versus state law, like policy stuff. I'm sure some of you were like, I totally got lost. But I hope some of that I hope stuck, which is that sort of these questions of state versus national legislation and New Yorkers continue to be important in the entire sort of series of conflicts in the 19th century at moments where sort of the nation has a reckoning over the future of slavery in the United States. I think I should probably maybe do one last question because we're, I think, at time. I'm happy to like stick around after if people have more questions, but you can battle it out.
I have one more, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, I'll wait.
Just curious, I know there's no good economic statistics from that era, but how much did slaves contribute to the economy of New York State in that era?
I mean, massively. I feel like it's like hard. I mean, it's hard to sort of underemphasize. And actually, this maybe goes back a little bit to your question, which I think is really interesting. There was like an older generation of historians who wrote about Northern slavery and abolition, and they were sort of like, well, labor needs changes. Like in it was sort of like a capitalist wage market means that like you actually want people just sort of like, you know, laboring for a wage in a market versus being enslaved. And I like just don't buy that for New York, in part because you can see like well into the 1800s, people who were continuing to own slaves are desperate for slave labor. Like they want to keep their slaves. They see that labor as important. And I think in some ways you could say, so some of it is like the obvious stuff, like if you have like a large farm in the Hudson River Valley, it's useful to have enslaved labor like growing wheat or chopping wood or tending the cows or whatever. But I think in New York, it's also because it was like a financial capital, it was a trading capital. Like so much of New York is actually about like its early colonial wealth is about the Hudson River Valley being like the breadbasket for the state in the larger area, about Albany being a trading post going back to sort of when it's like a Dutch trading fort. New York City does become the financial capital. It is an incredibly wealthy city. And so all of New York's sort of wealth in those areas is in part fueled by all the free labor that you're getting at home, right? So like if you're someone and you want to be a merchant and you like, let's say like you have a bad year because you make a bad bet, you might still have domestic workers in your home who you don't have to pay wages to, right? Or on a good year, if you need to go travel somewhere and you need someone to stay home and take care of your kids, you have free labor at home, right? So there are ways in which it's like, it's both about the physical thing, like, you know, like making dinner or growing a crop, but it's also about what enslaved labor allows in terms of like the growth of like the market economy in the 19th century and the particular economy that New York has always had as like a financial and commercial state. Does that make sense? Okay, that's a good question. Okay. I think I'll end there. Yeah.
I'll just mention one or two things really quickly.
Yeah, please.
We'll wrap it up. First, Sarah has books.
I do,
So if
that's
you're interested in purchasing her book, I'm sure she'll sign it for you. A reminder, July 27th, next talk back here. Hopefully everyone can make it. Next Sunday, right? Open house, 12 to 4, if you just want to stop in and wander around with your ledger. But spread the word. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.